Okay, so again, this is page 4, factoring and simplifying our radicals when they can't, be deemed a perfect value, a perfect square. So square root of 16, we always know what that is. What is that? 4. Okay, square root of 3, that happens to not be a perfect square. That's one of our irrationals, which means that if we take 16 and multiply it by 3, it gives us 48. Is 48 a perfect? No. So when you have a perfect square and a non-perfect square and you multiply those together, it's going to give you something that's also not perfect, but it's going to give you something that can technically be simplified. Same thing can also happen sometimes, that if you take the square root of 3 and the square root of 3 again, multiply them together, even though both of them are not perfect, they could technically come out to something that would make it perfect eventually. But let's take a look at what I was just saying before. 48. Square root of 48. So it's not a perfect square, but what you want to do in situations like this, when they tell you to simplify it, so you're not going to be using a calculator for that unit. You won't be trying to simplify them all the time. For the first few parts, you're going to be doing this without a calculator. And you're going to need to identify, this is why you need to have your perfect squares memorized. You're going to identify the largest perfect square factor. So when we talk about factors, we're talking about numbers that you multiply together and they will equal 48. So obviously we know we have 1 times 48. That's factor. Can 48 be divided by 2? Yes? Yes. 2 times what? 2 times 24. Okay, then you just keep listing the factors. It's also divisible by 3. We have 3 times 16. You have 4 times 12. And you have 6 times 8. These are all the factors that make up 48. Now, I want to find out which one happens to be the largest perfect square. So, first thing I should do is identify what my perfect squares are. 1 is a perfect square. Is 2 perfect?
No.
3?
No.
4?
Yes.
Yep. 6?
No.
48?
No.
24? No. 16? Yes. And that happens to be my largest one. 16 is my largest perfect square. So I'm going to use these factors. It's my largest perfect square, so I want to use those as my factors. So square root of 48, I want to break it apart into the square root of 16 times 3. By doing that, I know I can break this apart into individual square roots of 16 times an individual square root of 3. Now, square root of 16, like we said before, is perfect, isn't it?
Yeah.
What is the square root of 16?
4.
4. So that becomes 4. Square root of 3 is not perfect, and it can't be simplified any further. So it's 4 square root of 3. And that's our final answer. And the way that we read this as 4 square root of 3. So when I say that you need to simplify your radicals, this is what I mean that you need to be doing. This is simplifying your radical expression. Let's try another one. Square root of 75. It's not a perfect square, so now we need to identify the factors and see if there happens to be a perfect square factor in there. Who can tell me what's the first set of factors for 75? 1 and 75. What's the next set? Jimmy? 3 times 25. Any others? Salman? 5 times 15. That's it. Those are the only factors that 75 has. Anything up here a perfect square? What? 15 is not perfect. 25 is. Okay? And that's our largest perfect square. 1, of course, is also a perfect square, but we're never going to use that one. Okay, so 25, that's our largest perfect square. So that means when we break this apart, we're going to break it apart as the square root of 25 times 3, or the square root of 25 times the square root of 3. And what is the square root of 25? 5. So this now becomes 5 square root of 3. And then you're done. Emiliano? No, it just happens to be that in these two cases, 3 was a factor. But it won't always be that way. Huh? The 4 on the outside? This one right here. Once it's outside, it's no longer needing to be simplified. So when I say take the square root of 16, you tell me it's 4. You don't tell me that you're going to do square root again. Once you've taken the square root, it's done. So we took the square root of 16 and it gave us 4. That 4 is done. Any other questions? Try this one on your own. All right, raise your hand. Tell me what you got. Brent? 3 square root of 2 is correct. When you look at the factors are going to be 1 times 18 2 times 9, 3 times 6. 9 happens to be the largest perfect square, so that's the one that we're going to work with. So when we break this apart, we're going to break it apart as the square root of 9 times the square root of 2, because those are my two factors, 9 and 2. And the square root of 9 happens to be simplified to a 3, so we get 3 square root of 2. That's our final answer. Try another one. All right. What'd you get, Christopher? 8 square root of 2. Okay, so the factors, got 1 times 128. We've got 2 times 64. We've got 4 times 32. You've got 8 times 16. Okay, so these are all factors that happen to be part of the 128. Largest perfect square here is that 64. That's your largest, so that's the one that we're going to want to use when we break it down. So we're going to break it down to the square root of 64 times the square root of 2. Square root of 64 happens to be equal to 8, so we get 8 square roots of 2. Any questions? I think I'm going to stop it here then, and I'm going to give you guys your assignment for today because I don't want to add variables in it yet. So let's leave it at this because this is easy enough for you right now, right? Yeah? All right. So your assignment today is actually going to be on page 5. So turn to page 5 of your notebook. Again, you're going to go ahead and simplify all of these. Now, what do you think happens if you get a problem like, let's say that we get square root of 7? Is there any factor of 7 that's a perfect square? No. So if you come across a problem in which you cannot simplify it, you just put down that it cannot be factored. So actually go back to page 4. Let me write that down real quick for you guys. You get a problem like, we'll even go further than that. Like square root of, we'll say square root of 15. Square root of 15 does have factors. It's 1 times 15, and it's 3 times 5. But none of these happen to be perfect squares except for the 1. The 1 is the largest perfect square. So in a situation like this, it just cannot be factored. And that's your final answer. All right. So for your homework, oh, oops, my bad. My bad. No calculators.